I have said numerous times, and I will continue to say it, that God is a storyteller. The great storyteller. And like all great storytellers, he writes beautiful, beautiful stories. He writes the great story that begins with him saying, "Let there be light." And the culmination of all that is when the light of the world comes to make his home permanently forever upon the earth. You know, I'm reminded, even this morning we were singing Victory in Jesus. I'm reminded how often our minds go to our up and away place of dwelling. For instance, in Some Sweet Day, I'll sing up there the song of victory. Well, yeah, sure, we are going to sing it up there, but we're going to sing it down here on the earth more than we sing it up there. We are going to be on this new earth singing our song of victory forever and ever and ever. That is the story. Our leaving this place is just an intermediate period of time. Doug Wilson, one of my favorite authors and pastors, he's a Presbyterian, don't hold that against him, but he you know, we've all heard, you know, this earth is not my home, I'm just passing through. You know, you've all heard that. You know that's really not true, right? It's really not true. This earth is our home, and it will be our home forever and ever and ever. And the Lord is renovating it. He is making it new, and when Christ comes back, He'll make it permanently new. And what's funny is Doug Wilson said, "Heaven is not my home, I'm just passing through." The first time I heard that, I thought, what? Heaven is not my home, I'm just passing through? What in the world is he talking about? Well, he's talking about that intermediate state where we go, right? When we die, where Brother Bill Dawson is right now, he is in the intermediate state. But he's just going to be passing through that place until he comes back with the Lord. And he dwells in his new, renovated, resurrected body upon this new earth forever and ever and ever. So the story starts with God saying, "Let there be light." And the story ends when the light of the world comes down with his body to the earth. He renovates this place. He resurrects this place. And we, with our resurrected Jesus and our resurrected bodies, worship Christ forever and ever on the resurrected earth. In the middle of this story that God is writing, the plot completely changes, doesn't it? With the coming of Jesus Christ. When God became flesh and took on the form of humanity, the story radically changed. But it is not as if we did not see the story or that plot twist coming. All throughout the Old Testament, what God did is in His story, He put shadows and pictures and types, letting us know the story is about to change. The story is about to change. The story is about to change. Unfortunately, many of the Jewish people missed the pictures. They missed the shadows. They missed the types. So when the story changed, they missed it. We, as Christians, have the wonderful blessing of being able to look back into the Old Testament story and see all the pictures, all the shadows, all the types that pointed to Jesus. And that's what good storytellers do, right? When you're reading a book, C.S. Lewis said, any book worth reading means you haven't just read it once. So if you say you loved a book and you've only read it once, you didn't really love it. Because if you loved it, guess what you're going to do? You're going to go back and you're going to read it again. Because you're like, wait a minute, I must have missed stuff. There's something that was said that I didn't get. And then you go back and you reread it and you're like, oh man, they're totally setting this up. I didn't see it the first time. I didn't see the setup. But now I see the setup because I'm able to go back and I'm able to see it. Well, that's what we get to do with the Old Testament is we get to go back now with our Jesus glasses on, with the story, the plot already changing, and we're able to see God writing in pictures of Jesus throughout the Old Testament. The Old Testament is full of shadows pointing to Christ. Let me just give you a few of these I'm sure you know of. Jesus is the high priest. Every time that high priest entered into the Holy of Holies, and Jesus is the Holy of Holies. But anytime that the high priest entered into the Holy of Holies, he was shadowing Jesus, who is our go-between, our mediator for us. Jesus is the mercy seat. Remember, he would take the blood of the lamb. The high priest would enter into the Holy of Holies, and he would take that blood, which the blood is a picture of Jesus. And he would sprinkle that blood on the mercy seat. And that mercy seat is a picture of Jesus. Jesus is our mercy seat. Jesus is the sacrificial lamb. Jesus, every time that they killed that lamb, they sacrificed that offering, it's a picture of Jesus. The scapegoat that they would send out into the wilderness, they would lay hands on that scapegoat and they would ceremonially transfer the guilt of the people onto that goat, and they would let that goat go into the wilderness. Again, a picture of Jesus. The staff that Moses lifted up when the victory was happening. Remember, when the staff came down, they would begin to lose. When the staff was raised, they would win. And eventually Moses got so tired he couldn't lift up the staff on his own anymore. And so he had to have people come and hold up his hands for him. But as long as that rod was elevated, the people won. Well, Jesus is that rod. He is the one that we exalt and we lift up. Jesus is also pictured in the wisdom of Solomon. He is pictured by the manna that was given every single day except the Sabbath day to the people of Israel. Jesus is the bread of life, come down from heaven. Anyone who eats of him will live. Jesus also pictured in the story of Hosea. Hosea's wife, former prostitute, kept leaving him and going back to her old ways. I'm sure everything within Hosea wanted to abandon her and leave her, and God said, you go get her. And he went and he got her and he brought her back. She rebelled again, and God said, you go get her. Hosea was a picture of the unconditional, unending, steadfast love of the Lord for his people, for his bride. Over and over and over again, we see these shadows or pictures. About 7 years ago, I did a series called Shadows, where we literally, there was about 12 of them. We just took a shadow and we worked through the shadow and we saw all the ways that it pointed to Christ. I've heard people say that the first gospel declaration in the Bible is when God cursed the serpent. And he said to the serpent, you're going to crawl out on your belly, but the seed of the woman, you're going to bruise his heel, but he will crush your head. And many people say that is the first declaration of the gospel. And I guess technically that's true. That is the first declaration of the gospel. But it's not the first picture of the gospel. See, the first picture of the gospel is when God gave Eve to Adam. That's the first picture of the gospel in the entire Bible. The very first thing that God does in human history is he brings a wife to Adam, and that marriage is a picture of the gospel. Marriage exists ultimately to display the covenant-keeping love between Christ and his church. There are many reasons why Christians should be against divorce and why Christians should be against so-called same-sex marriage. The ultimate reason why Christians should be against divorce and why we should be against so-called same-sex marriage is because it distorts the picture of the gospel that marriage is. When we do not uphold the sanctity of marriage, we're distorting the original picture given to humanity of the gospel of Jesus Christ. You really cannot say it enough. Marriage is a model of Christ and the church. Marriage is a model of Christ and the church. And when we grasp that truth, then all of a sudden marriage is going to make more sense. My role as husband will make more sense when I understand that my marriage, that role is a picture of Christ. Wives, your role will make more sense. Your marriage will make more sense when you understand that it is a picture of Christ and the church. There are at least 3 reasons that John Piper gives for why we should always and constantly be saying that marriage is a picture of Christ and the church. I want to give you those three tonight. Number one, when we focus on marriage as being a picture of Christ and the church, it will lift marriage out of its sordid sitcom images, and it gives it the magnificent meaning God would have it have. You see, I like a good sitcom as much as anybody, but you ever notice the relationship between husband and wife in sitcoms? Very rarely do you go, now that's a marriage I wish everybody had. Right? You always watch them and you're like, well, that marriage is horrible. That man's a buffoon. Right? I mean, that's usually how they do it, right? The man's an idiot that can't do anything. And that's the way they make it up. And it's funny, like, look at that man that can't do anything. When we focus on marriage, though, as being a picture of Christ and the church, it's going to lift it up past those models that we see in our culture. And of course, you know, sitcoms are just one example of how we portray marriage as less than God's perfect vision for it. Second, this gives marriage a solid basis in grace. This gives marriage a solid basis in grace. Because Christ obtained and sustains His bride by grace alone. Let me say that again. This is very important. When we view marriage as a picture of Christ and the church, then what we're doing is we're making marriage all about grace. Because that's exactly how Christ obtained and sustains His bride, is through His grace. So when we make it all about that, our marriages will become all about grace. And number three, this shows that the role of husband as head and the role as wife as helper, but as one who is to submit, those roles are crucial. When we see that marriage is a picture of Christ and the church, it makes the role of husband and the role of wife crucial in the way that they are performed. That is why these roles are woven into the fabric of marriage by God, because they're crucial pictures. They're pictures, by the way, that a man and a man cannot display. They are pictures that a woman and a woman cannot display. They are certainly pictures that a divorced marriage cannot display. When God thought up marriage, it was ultimately the gospel of Christ that was on His mind. When God thought up marriage, it was ultimately the gospel of Christ that was on His mind. Marriage was set forth as a picture of Christ and the church because it is the only human relationship that is based on lifetime covenant. There is no other human relationship that human beings enter into that is lifetime covenant. Marriage, however, is. And so God set marriage up that way to be a picture of Christ and the church. When we study justification in the New Testament, we understand that justification is part and parcel to understanding the gospel. You cannot say that you comprehend the gospel if you get justification wrong. Justification by grace through faith, without understanding that, you do not understand the gospel. It is essential to the gospel. And justification has two basic concepts to it. One is the forgiveness of sin. If I have been justified by the work of Jesus Christ through faith, not of works, but by faith, then I have been forgiven all my sin. Not some of my sin, Not all of my sin, but just part way. No, all of my sin, all the way, completely forgiven, thrown as far as the east is from the west, put behind God's back, never to be brought up again, never to be held against me. I stand before God completely and totally forgiven. We could pray, we could leave, and it ought to change our lives. When we get that. However, the gospel of justification is not just about the forgiveness of sin. It is also about the imputation of righteousness. So it's not that God just takes sin out of your account. He then takes the righteousness of Jesus and puts it into your account. Think about that, Christian. Visualize a bank account, right? And you look at that bank account, and the only thing in that bank account is infinite debt. You can never get out of it. No matter how much currency you think you can get, no matter how hard you work, you are never getting out of infinite debt. That is what you owe, and there's nothing you can do about it. And yet God steps in and says, not only will I clear you from your debt, not only will I remove the debt out of your account, I will put infinite wealth and infinite treasure into your account, namely the righteousness of Jesus Christ. That is justification. And to not grasp justification is to miss the core of the gospel. Martin Luther, who we will be talking about in our next series, Martin Luther fought and fought and fought over justification by faith. Because he understood it was the core. Charles Haddon Spurgeon was criticized for preaching justification by faith too much. Someone came up to him after one of his sermons and said, how come you are always preaching justification by faith? And he said, I assure you, when I believe that my congregation has grasped it, I will stop preaching it. Because he believed it was so core to the gospel. And as we said, it is all of grace. That being forgiven and made righteous by God is all of grace. We do not earn it and we do not work for it. Turn with me to Colossians chapter 3. Say, why are we talking about all this? I thought we were talking about wives and the role of wives and how, well, we're going to get to that, but we got some foundational things we kind of got to address before we can get to that. Colossians chapter 3, verses 12 and 13. Put these things on. Live these things out. That's what Paul's saying. Put these things on. As God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, put on compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another, and if one has a complaint against another, forgiving each other. As the Lord has forgiven you, so you must also forgive one another. Here's what Paul is saying. Paul is saying, when you grasp justification, when you get that it is all about grace, when you get forgiveness, when you get being made righteous, when you get being able to stand before God in a proper relationship as a chosen one who is holy and beloved, when you get how that is made possible, that it is all by God's grace, then what you're supposed to do is you're supposed to take that vertical relationship that is all of grace and you are to bend it horizontally to the relationships that you have in your life. In other words, once you grasp your relationship with God being all of grace, then you can understand how the relationships in your life should be all about grace. If God has forgiven me, what right do I have not to forgive someone else? If God bears with me in my weaknesses, what right do I have to not bear with other people in theirs? Now let's take this and let's apply it to marriage. Once I understand that justification is part and parcel to the gospel, and my marriage is supposed to display the gospel, is it not? Is that not why God put us together as husband and wife? To display the gospel? If I understand that justification is the core of the gospel, then when I get married, I am now supposed to display in my life the vertical justification bent down toward my spouse. What right do I have not to forgive Jessica when God has forgiven me so much? What right do I have to hold something against her when God holds nothing against me? What right do I have not to bear with her weaknesses when God bears with me? So if my marriage is going to display the gospel, then it's got to display justification bent outwardly. He who has been forgiven much loves much. Why? Because he understands what he's been forgiven for. A friend of mine, I think I mentioned this last week, and I've shared it a few different times, but a friend of mine shared some very, very hard stuff with me over the last few weeks. I mean, some rough stuff that he has done in his life. Stupid stuff, wicked stuff that he has since repented of, praise God, and the Lord is restoring him. He shared a 2-hour-long story with me, and he looks up at me at the end with tears in his eyes, and he says, "Are you shocked by everything I've done?" And I looked at him and I said, "I'm not shocked one bit, because I know me. I don't have to know you. I know me. And I know what I have been forgiven for. And I know what I would be without Christ. So no, I'm not shocked, because I know Neil Sandlin." You see, but once I grasp that and I understand what God has done for me, then what I can do is I can bend that kind of grace to my spouse. So if our marriages are going to be a display of the gospel, then they must be a display of grace. Justification bent outward. Now we can move to the famous passage in Ephesians chapter 5, where Paul deals with relationships between husbands and wives. In fact, I don't think I've ever been to a marriage. I know I've definitely never performed one, and I know because I use Brother James' notes, he's never performed one, that does not use Ephesians chapter 5 in the message. Yeah, just to let you know, whenever I perform a wedding ceremony, I'm just using Brother James' notes. Started doing my own one year, and Brother James handed me his, and I thought, well, why do my own? Ephesians chapter 5. I'm going to go ahead and read verses 22 through 33, and then we're going to focus on 22 and 33 for the most part tonight. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 22. Wives, submit to your own husbands as unto the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church, his body, and is himself its Savior. Now as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her, that he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes it and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother, hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. If all of this is true that we've said so far, then women have a profound calling within marriage, namely the role of being the picture of the church. Wives have a divine calling to be the picture of the church of Jesus Christ within marriage. So let's take a look at verses 22, 23, and 24 in a little in-depth to find out how this picture works. How does this picture of wives being the church work? Well, the very beginning, submit to. Wives, submit to. It is important to note that wives are supposed to submit to their husbands. Every passage of Scripture in the New Testament that deals with the role of husband and wives says this very same thing. Ephesians 5:22, Colossians 3:18, 1 Peter 3:1, and Titus 2:4. All of them, when dealing with the role of husband and wives, all of them say the same thing to the wife. Wives, submit to your husbands. This is a fundamental thing to being a Christian wife. So women, listen to me. Fundamental to your marriage, fundamental to you being a picture of the church, is you submitting to your husband. It is absolutely, in fact, the way I wrote this is fundamental to being a Christian wife. Period. The word period. There's no altering it. There's no changing it. There's no trying to get around it. If you are going to say, I want to be a godly Christian wife, then you will submit to your husband. Period. Number 2, your own husband. Your own husband. Did I put husbands down in the notes?
Yes.
Just one of them. Don't have two. Just one. Notice, verse 22 does not say wives submit to husbands. It says submit to your own. To your own. I guess I put husbands because he's talking plural, right, about all the women with all their husbands. But submit to your own husband. I have said this before. I think I said it last week, and I will say it again. My wife is not to submit to any man as her head in this church, except for me. That's right. That is it. Now, she has a submission that she is supposed to have to the elders of this church, but there's only one man on this planet that she is to submit to as her head upon this earth, and that is me. No other man gets to tell my wife how she should conduct herself or what she should do. If you have an issue with my wife, you come to me. Especially another man. I said last week, I'm a lover, not a fighter, guys. It takes a lot for me to get riled up. But you start messing with Jessica, Renee, Victoria, McMullen, Sandlin, and I will get riled up. She has a lot of names. I will get riled up. I am her husband. She is submit to her own husband. And as I was thinking about this, I believe the Lord just kind of laid this on my heart. Think about why that has to be the case. Who does the church submit to? One head. Right? One head. Christ. The church doesn't submit to a multitude of heads. One head. That is why it must, if the picture is going to stay intact, then the wife has to submit to one head, her husband. So again, it distorts the picture if men in the church think because we're men, we're head over the women in our church. False. You are not. If you are married, you are the head of one, and she is to submit to one. And I've said this before, and I'm not trying to degrade the men in our church, but I have very few men have I ever run across who is equal to my wife. She is more capable than most men that I have met. She is smarter than most men that I have met. She is as stubborn as most no, I'm just playing. That is a little truth there. We bear with one another, babe. We were talking about that earlier. Likewise, there is one husband that the wife is supposed to submit to, therefore keeping the picture intact. Submit to your own husbands as unto the Lord. What does it mean that she is to submit as unto the Lord? Well, this has a multitude of meanings. I want to point out at least a couple of them. One, when a wife submits to her own husband, it is in obedience to the Lord. It is obeying the Lord to obey her husband in all things. So when a wife submits to her husband, she is in obedience to God. It is her obeying God. Another thing that it means is that that a wife should submit to her husband as she would submit to the Lord. In other words, that same kind of attitude, a respect, a right spirit, it's not simply obeying the action, right? And we run across this with kids. I think the first time I ever heard this story, Brother James shared it, was a little boy who was being told to stand up in class. He didn't want to stand up in class, and the teacher was like, you are going to stand up in class right now. He didn't want to stand up in class, and finally the teacher told the boy, you're going to be in a lot of trouble. Here's what's going to happen if you don't stand up. And that boy stood up, and we can imagine the body posture that he had as he stood up. And he said, well, I'm standing up on the outside, but I'm sitting down on the inside. That's not the kind of submission that we're talking about here. You see, when we're to obey the Lord, it's not just simple action the Lord is looking for. It's a condition of the heart that He's looking for. Are we going to obey with reverence? Are we going to obey with a right spirit? Are we going to obey properly or just simple action? If a wife decides, I'm going to submit to my husband, I'm going to do what he asks, but I certainly am not going to do it with the right spirit, is that unto the Lord? No, it's not unto the Lord. This statement is very important. Husbands are Christ-like. They are not Christ. Husbands are Christ-like. They are not Christ. Which means that women are to submit to the leadership of their husbands the way they submit to Christ. It doesn't mean you view your husband as equal to Christ. But the same manner that you obey the Lord and you submit to Him is the same manner in which you are to submit to your husband. So submit to your own husbands as unto the Lord. Number 4, the husband is the head of the wife. That's what it says in verse 23. For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church. A wife's submission can only be properly understood in light of the husband's headship. And as we've already demonstrated, remember we told you we talked about that word head? Remember, some people try to say, well, that word head just means source, right? That Jesus is the source of the church, right? He's the head of the church. He's the source of the church. And you remember we went back and we looked at other passages of scriptures, one in Colossians, one in Ephesians, where Paul says that Christ is the head over all things. And there he is not saying that Christ is the source over all things. He is saying that Christ is the authority over all things. This word head has to do with leadership and authority. It has to do with the authority over the church. Christ is the authority over the church, and husbands are the authority over their wives. Headship, listen to this statement. Headship is a divine appointment. God has made Neil Sandlin the head over his wife. I did not choose that. That was not something that I got to pick. God said, okay, here's a bunch of different roles you can have, Neil. Which one would you like to pick in this marriage? That role was appointed to me as the husband. This was all God's idea. This is not my idea. This is not the husband's idea. This is God's idea. And that divine role is the basis for which the wife submits. We need to grasp that. Wives need to grasp that. The reason why Jessica should submit to me as her head is because that role that God has, that role that I have is God-given. That means that a wife's submission is not given because the man lives up to everything that he should live up to. I am a moron. Fact. I didn't say that at shock value or a joke. I do so many stupid stuff. And sometimes Jessica looks at me, and it's, righteous indignation that she looks at me with. Other times it looks at me and she just shakes her head like, what's wrong with you? I'm like, I don't know. I haven't been completely glorified yet. There is no way that Jessica could ever submit to me as her head if her submission was based upon how I performed as the leader. Right? Any wife looking for an excuse to get out of submission could use that one. Any wife. Well, my husband doesn't lead like he should, so therefore I'm not going to submit. What husband leads like he should? I said, we are Christ-like, we are not Christ. I cannot perfectly picture Jesus in everything that I do. That is why the role is not earned, it is divinely appointed. God does not look at Neil Sandlin and say, Neil Sandlin is worthy to be the head of his wife. That's not what God did. God said, I am going to appoint this role to a husband because I want him to picture my son, Jesus. And the reason why the wife should submit to the husband is not because he's performing perfectly. It is because of the appointed role that he has in this picture. So if my divinely appointed role as the picture of Jesus, if that's given to me and appointed to me by God, then therefore the basis of the wife's submission ought to be based upon that role given to the husband. It's very important. That's why Paul brings it up here. And then lastly, number 5. So also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. Paul concludes this section by telling the wives, just like the church submits to Christ in everything, so too wives are to submit in everything to their husbands. And what he's doing is Paul is getting rid of any idea that this submission only applies to a certain narrow realm of life. In other words, just in the way that we conduct ourselves here. The only time the man leads is in this narrow thing. Or the only time the man is the head is when we're dealing with this issue. No, Paul is saying in all of life, between a husband and a wife, the man is the head. He should lead in all areas. And the wife is to submit to him in all areas of life. Now, it goes without saying for Paul, as it should go without saying for us, wives do not follow their husbands into sin. Okay? Paul is not saying, and if he leads you into sin, you just go right ahead and do it. He is Christ-like, he is not Christ. The wife should not act unilaterally, just as the church does not act unilaterally. And then I want to make this statement because I think it's one of the most profound things that wives who might be struggling with this idea of submission. We've already mentioned it in a few other sessions, but if any wife is struggling with this idea of submission, this statement is very important for you. When the church submits to Jesus Christ as their Lord and as their Savior, are they enslaved and bound in bondage, or are they freed? Now, I know we're slaves to Christ, but we're freed, aren't we? Is there joy in our submission to Jesus? Yes. Is there freedom in our submission to Jesus? Yes. Is there satisfaction in our submission to Jesus? You see, when the church submits to Christ, it doesn't demean the church. It doesn't enslave the church. It doesn't stifle the church. It actually allows the church to flourish as the church should. And so too, when wives submit to their husbands, it does not demean them. It does not stifle their growth or their freedom. And it does not enslave them. But it opens them up to be everything that God has intended for them to be within a wife who is fulfilling her role of submission to her husband. You will find joy and satisfaction and freedom and peace. You'll find growth. See, so often the world hears that word submit, and they have no clue what they're talking about. I mean, zero clue. Right? They have no concept of roles and that it's a picture of Christ and the church. I mean, no concept of any of that. They just see that word submit and they think, oh, if a wife is supposed to submit to her husband in all things, this is going to just destroy womanhood. Very opposite. The very opposite. That's just simple pride, saying God doesn't know better. I know better, God doesn't know better. Before we end tonight, we need to call our attention to the end of this passage where Paul quotes Genesis chapter 2, verse 24 in Ephesians 5:31. So look at verse 31. Therefore a man shall leave his father and leave his mother and cling to his wife. I have actually not married a couple in this church because the wannabe groom did not have a job. He had no way to provide or protect for his family. And they were just going to move in with her family and just bum off them. By the way, that was about maybe 3 years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, and still living off mom and dad. And I told him, I said, that's not the function of what a husband is supposed to be doing. Now, I know there's times where, things happen. But you don't plan it. You don't go into it planning. Here he says you leave your father and your mother and you become a separate family unit. Another reason why that is because in many situations, the picture of Christ in the church is going to be distorted if you have a husband and a wife who are bumming off parents. Now, there's a difference between getting help from your parents and bumming off parents. I'm talking about bumming off parents. Why? Because who's the authority in the relationship? It's not the husband. It's whoever you're living with. Again, distorts the picture. Paul says that marriage is a mystery. Verse 32. This mystery is profound. Now, what is the mystery? Yes, certainly, as we say in our wedding ceremony, it is a mystery how God can take two lives, two hearts, two people who are separate and make them one. I mean, that is a mystery. Is that the ultimate mystery that Paul's referring to here? No. Brother James has said this when he preached through Ephesians. Paul uses this word mystery in Ephesians a lot. And here's what he means by that. It's something that used to be hidden that's now been revealed. In Moses' day, when Moses wrote Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, for this reason a husband should leave his father and mother and cling to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. When that was originally written, did they understand the gospel of Jesus Christ? No, they did not. Did they understand how marriage was a picture of the gospel of Jesus Christ? No, they did not. It was a mystery to them that has now been revealed. We now, as Christians, we see how it pictures Christ in the church. It's been revealed with the coming of Jesus Christ. So now we, as Christians, understand that marriage is a picture of the gospel. When Paul wanted a picture of Christ in the church, he did not have to go hunting for one. Right? Now, as pastors, Brother James kind of hinted at this morning, it's difficult sometimes to find an illustration that works with what you're trying to get across. Right? You're like, okay, I want to get this across. Especially like with teenagers, right? You're like, okay, I want to get this across to the young people. What illustration can I use to get this across to them? And sometimes it's just really, really difficult. You have to kind of go hunt for them. And I know I don't know if youth pastors use these, but there were these books of like illustrations, and so you go down and pick a topic and pick an illustration. That perturbs me. That's a side note though. But a lot of times you have to go hunting for those things. Paul does not have to go hunting for a picture of Christ in the church. The very fabric of the first relationship between human beings on the planet, the very fabric of that relationship is the illustration for Christ in the church. He didn't have to go hunting one down. God gave us one at the very beginning of human history. It's so fundamental. to a picture of gospel. Paul is saying then, by going back and quoting Genesis 2:24, Paul is saying that when God made marriage, He had Christ and the church in mind. When God made marriage between Adam and Eve, He had you in mind. That should just blow us away. Wives, what a privilege you have. Christian wives, what a privilege you have to model. You get to model what the church is supposed to do in relationship to Christ. That's your role. God says to wives, I've given you a divinely appointed role to be a picture of the church's relationship with Jesus. And when you submit to your husband as unto the Lord, you are picturing the gospel. When you take the vertical justification and you bend it toward your husband, you are picturing the gospel of Jesus Christ. What a privilege. What an honor that God has given Christian wives.